This is my continuing coverage of Henry Ward Beecher and his sermons, and today we're going to be talking about growing in the knowledge of God. How do you do that? Well, it's not exactly like you go to God's house, knock on his door, he invites you in for a cookie social, and you have one-on-one interaction with God. It doesn't work that way. Now, there have been a few people alive who have had what I consider the closest thing to personal interaction with God. Now, the disciples really had it close because they were interacting with Jesus, and he was God. But I'm thinking more in the line of Moses. Although Moses never saw God's face, he was able to talk face to face with God. Okay? Now, how did communication in the Old Testament work with God? Well, most of the time, here's how it worked. Let's say the king of Israel or the commander of the Israeli army had a question for God. Oh, we got to know if we're going to go to war or not, or something like that. Well, here's how that worked. What they would do is they go to the high priest. The high priest would then see that they had a question. So the high priest would go in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and he would look directly at it. Now, the king or the commander of the army would stand behind the high priest and would look at the high priest's back. And what the king or the commander of the army would do is he would whisper the question that he had for God in a reverent way. As soon as that happened, the high priest would be enveloped with the divine glory of God. And when that happened, the high priest would look down at his breastplate. Now, this breastplate had stones all over it, different colored stones. And based upon how the light refracted from the stones, he was then therefore able to spell out the answer that God wanted the king or the commander of the army to have. Do we have to do that today? No. Okay, so how does God answer us today? Well, let me give you a perfect example of this. This is kind of a real simplistic answer. Let's say you get yourself a paper cut. Well, it's probably not the first one you ever got. Now, when you were a little kid, you probably got a paper cut back then, too. What happened? Well, because you didn't know what to do about paper cuts, what you would do is you'd go to your parent, and your parent would put a little medicine on it, put a bandage on it, and that'd be the end of it. Well, when you get older, what happens is you remember those experiences from your youth, and then you know exactly what to do about your paper cuts. That's a question you don't have to ask God. God just causes you to remember what you need to remember. Okay? So the first information that you get about the knowledge of God, how you get to know God, that first information usually comes from a parent. Sometimes the parent provides a lot of information, and that's good. Sometimes the parents don't do such a good job, and that's bad. Now, the second source of information about the knowledge of God, if you really want to get to know God, is here, in the Bible. That's why it was written. So now you can pretty much get to know God pretty good. So, if your parents don't do a really super job of training you about God, then what you do is you learn how to read, how to write, how to do arithmetic, and a whole bunch of other things. And then you can read something like this, and properly translated, you can get to know God pretty good. So that's the second way you can get to know God. But there is yet another way that comes about later. And that's interesting because we're going to bring up that story about the bandage at this point. Often God will put you into various experiences. Let's say you're driving down a dark, deserted road. It's wintertime. You're really scared. Well, just remember, God's riding shotgun with you, if you let him. That's the comforter side of God. God will put you in that experience so you can have the experience of knowing how well God can comfort you in a stressful situation. Believe me, if you have God as your shotgun partner in your car on a dark, deserted road, maybe later on you end up in jail. Well, God's in that jail cell with you, if you let Him be. Okay? Now, maybe you face some kind of an injustice. Well, when you're a kid, you face that injustice, and you receive a penalty like, say, you get put in a timeout or something like that. Just remember, God's with you in that timeout. If you're put there unfairly, God will give you justice if you ask Him. Okay? That comes in handy later on. Let's say you get a traffic ticket that you're not supposed to get, or somehow you end up getting arrested and you're not supposed to be. God will be in that courtroom with you. God will be there when you receive that injustice, so that when you turn to Him, He'll provide you the justice that you're looking for. What about forgiveness? Same way. The only way to understand God's forgiveness is to experience it. Trust me. So God will put you in situations where you'll need forgiveness, and then you can experience that forgiveness. And the way you experience that forgiveness from God then flows through you and makes you a more forgiving person. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. Okay? Now, what about God being the provider? Well, you can read about it in the book all you want. You can read about it here in the Bible. Give us this day our daily bread. But to truly understand that concept, God will place you in situations where you'll need Him to provide things for you. Maybe bills will run amok and you don't have any food on the table. That's when you call upon God's provision. And then, there you go. If you do it as a little kid, it gets easier to do when you're an adult. That's how you learn about God. God can be your constant traveling companion. Wherever you go, you can invite God to go along with you. And if you do, it's always better off. You're always better off if you invite God to go with you. Now, keep in mind one other thing. There's a lot of people that say, well, you can't do anything. God's the only person that can do anything, and you can't do it. You're not an invalid to God. But God will only permit you to change things that God Himself wants changed. If God doesn't want something changed, you'll never be able to change it. So yes, you can change things that God permits you to change. But the biggest thing you can change is yourself. And that's one thing you can do. Whew. God's not going to stop you from learning higher language skills, mathematics, accounting. Listen, Matthew was a tax collector. He knew accounting. If you want to follow that example, maybe we should learn accounting too. Might not hurt. God is not going to stop you from learning practical things like mechanical skills or learning how to fix computers or stuff like that. Something that will benefit you. Now, granted, God's not going to stand there and let you learn how to manufacture narcotics. That's not the way that works. But God will allow you to learn practical skills. You can even learn how to fish. God's not going to stop you on learning that. See what I mean? Well, hopefully you learned a little bit from this. I will tell you more in a future video, so stay tuned.